This is the LatinNews Podcast. I am your host here, Richard McCall in Bogota, Colombia. Our very special guest this week is here as well on not a routine visit back to Colombia, but for those of you who follow academic articles and writing about peace in Colombia, well, you'll no introduction to Andrei Gómez Súarez, who is a senior researcher at the University of Winchester and general director of the Anglo Colombian peacebuilding organizing association called the Rodeemos Dialogo. So, Andrei, welcome on the LatinNews Podcast.
Richard, thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here with your audience.
It's great that you're here in Colombia. It's great that you're here in Bogota, and we can speak in the same time zone and discuss what's going on in Colombia, because it's never calm in Colombia, but I would say that we're in a turbulent moment, or certainly it feels unstable. We give a little bit of background to what's going on. Of course, those of you who follow Latin America and follow Colombia know that we have our first ever leftist president, a former M19 guerrilla in Gustavo Petro. He has now, he's done 2 years in the job, more or less. One of the cornerstone policies of his government is, of course, is the Paz Total, or total peace, and that's what we'll be discussing with Andrei. But also, he believes and very much has lauded the policy of being a government of change, and therefore getting reforms, more equitable reforms, pushed through Congress and the Senate to make change in Colombia. So before we focus on, and there are so many negatives that come out in the international press and national press about what he's doing, but perhaps we could focus quickly on the positives. He has pushed through a more equitable tax code. He has reestablished diplomatic and commercial ties with Venezuela, neighboring Venezuela. He has maintained, albeit somewhat wobbly, but good relations with the US, despite there being a difference in drug policy practices. He's got the pension reform through Congress. It just needs to be signed off by the Constitutional Court. And, well, he'll be working towards other things as well. And then on the negative side, at the moment, his approval rating stands at 32%. His disapproval rating stands at 62%. But he's a stubborn man. And he's barreling forwards with more desires on affecting this government of change. Andrei, perhaps you could jump in and give us a little bit of your feeling as to what is going on right now with the government of Gustavo Petro.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I think you're right. Petro has been for the first 2 years of his presidency, so he's getting to half term. The first year was about learning to be government. This is the first time ever we have a leftist government. The left had never been allowed to get into power, and it's been a steep curve of learning. So the first year was mainly spent on that. I think he managed to pass the tax reform, as you mentioned. That was a great achievement of President Petro. But second year has been a bit more complicated. Some of the other important reforms have been stuck. He didn't get the health reform that for him was very important. And his communications campaign has been a bit of a challenge for I would say, the general audience in Colombia. As we know, he has been facing harsh criticism from all the mainstream media in Colombia, because the media in Colombia is owned by big money people, like the proper economic establishment in Colombia. And he has realized that the only way to communicate his policies is by him becoming the communicator. So he's the center of attention. His Twitter is really where he communicates everything, and he tries to control the political agenda through that. On the back of that, he's been working to try to achieve total peace in Colombia. And I think that's what we're going to spend the next 25 minutes or so talking about. But I think that's a really important policy that has a good analysis of the root causes of the conflict, but tremendous challenges to be implemented.
And I think we need to look at this as well. I've been very supportive as an analyst, consultant, journalist looking at total peace, having been here for many years. When it was first announced and when he talked about it as an inaugural address, which people will be obviously quoting for years to come, because it was an incredible inaugural address, his presidential address. He's taking the armed conflict in a different sense. The first time that people are looking at this from the causes of the conflict and inclusion and trying to negotiate with all different groups at once. Now, this is obviously incredibly different. And I don't remember, it's the Red Cross or another entity has said that there are 6 to 8 ongoing conflicts within Colombia. And these are conflicts within illegal armed groups against one another and illegal armed groups and the state. It just makes this very complex. And you can also understand, okay, we have this problem in Colombia. We have had a long-running internal conflict involving left-wing guerrillas. We've had the 2016 peace accord, which took the majority of the FARC guerrillas, so the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, and we date back to 1964 and the Cold War and everything else. Most of them were, signed up to the 2016 peace accord under President Juan Manuel Santos. And now there's a negotiation, and I think we'll start with the ELN, the other leftist group that remains, the National Liberation Army. And this has been on again, off again for, I think it's 7 different presidencies talks with the ELN. What is different this time around? Is this a group that really wants to sign up for peace?
Well, that's a difficult question because it's a question that should be answered in the most honest way, and is saying that you don't usually get groups who are really willing to sign a peace agreement. What you need to do is to get them into the process of negotiating peace to realize that that's what they want to do. So I would say that the ELN really distrust the Colombian state. They see the arrival of Petro as an opportunity for them to start negotiations with a new government, but they are skeptical of the government being able to be not trapped within the infrastructure of a state that has been built by the Colombian elites and for the benefits of the Colombian elites. What I think is important to know in terms of this attempt to find a negotiated deal with the ELN is that Duque really left the process almost agonizing. As we know, he broke the negotiations that had started under President Juan Manuel Santos, and he actually even campaigned in the US for Cuba to be, again, one country listed as a country that supports terrorism, thanks to the support that Cuba has allowed for the negotiations with the ELN. So really, there was no trust between the ELN and the Colombian state at all when Petro arrived to the presidency. And what this process has done is to actually put at the center of the negotiations a key element that all the other presidents were quite skeptical of, and is the participation of civil society as the core of the negotiation. So both the ELN and the Colombian government in the last 2 years have managed to agree on how to create a methodology for Colombian civil society to participate on a national level dialogue in order to agree on the most important structural transformations that need to take place in Colombia in order to overcome the inequality and the poverty that prevails in many regions of the country. And I think that's tremendously different from previous negotiations where the state was very worried of giving too much participation of civil society. And if there is a reason of hope in these negotiations, is that both the Colombian government and the ELN are interested in listening to the civil society to hear what are the transformations that are needed to build peace in Colombia.
So this sounds all very positive indeed. When you get a group like the ELN coming to the table with their list of requirements, requirements like to overhaul and change the capitalist system within Colombia, it's a far-fetched it's a far-fetched requirement. It just sort of leaves more questions than it does answers. And I wonder as well, and there's a lot of talk about fracturing with the ELN, because you've got the older generation, it's like the real believers in Marxism and so on, who are in Cuba or in Venezuela engaged in the peace dialogues. But then you've got the younger generations on the ground, let's say in Nariño or Putumayo, strategic departments in Colombia, coca growing, transshipment, arms, whatever, anything illegal. These are key key departments. How connected are they to the older, we call them the secretariat, that was the part where the older sort of leaders of the ELN? Surely there must be a disconnect.
I think when understanding the ELN is one of the biggest challenges in Colombia, because the part of the ELN that is in arms, let's say, is rather small. If you think about the size of people in arms of the ELN, it's around 3,000, 4,000 people in arms. And within those, you are right that there is a sector of them who are very young and have just been brought into the group and are in a process of indoctrination, let's say. But beyond that, the ELN has a broad social network of people who sympathize with the ideas of liberation theology and Camilo Torres. And that is a large sector of social movements in Colombia that have a huge influence on the top leadership of the ELN. So when we're thinking about the success of the negotiations with the ELN, it's about connecting the needs of the people who empathize with the ideas of Camilo Torres and connecting that with the leadership of the ELN to convince them that giving up their weapons is a good idea in order to get the transformations that the country needs done. What is going to happen with the new people who have joined the group? The belief is that some of those people, if you get the structural reforms done, if these people have access to education, if these people have access to a different legal economies within the country, if they have access to health, if they have new opportunities brought up to them, they won't necessarily stick to doing the legal economies in which they are done. Now, that said, we all need to be realistic that if we look at the 2016 peace agreement, that is one of the most successful peace agreements in the world in terms of reintegration of former combatants, even this peace agreement had a number of 10% of the FARC combatants, less than 10%, had gone back to take up arms. And, together, 10% of probably 5 to 7% of those never gave up their weapons. So it is unrealistic to think that every single member of the ELN is going to give up their weapons. But what is possible is to create a socio-political economic process for the large sector associated with the ELN to move into an idea that arms are not needed in order to fight against the Colombian state. And I think that's a real possibility now, despite the tensions that exist within some fronts of the ELN in the country.
And we need to talk about the front, that is one wing of the ELN in Nariño. It's the Frente Rodeemos del Sur. This group, and it's not widely known outside of Colombia or outside of, I would say, academic circles or peace building circles. This group is very close to signing up to, let's say, I wouldn't say a peace agreement, but an agreement in that the aid and the government, the entities and the government will move in with an integrated project in the region to promote a sustainable economy, healthcare, education, and communication, of course, for an area that has traditionally been overlooked in Colombia. Do you see this as happening? I mean, or is it something that the ELN in Cuba or Venezuela might sabotage?
That's a really important question. And let me try to answer this from a different perspective. The idea of a negotiation in Nariño is not only, or the solution of peace building in Nariño is not only connected to the Frente Comuneros del Sur. So it is one part of the puzzle, but it would be a mistake to look at the negotiations between the Frente Comuneros del Sur and the Colombian government as an isolated process. Okay? Nariño is part of the second phase of total peace. I would call it that particular way, because in the second phase of total peace, what you are talking about is territorialization of peace. So you want to go to the regions, and when you want to look at the whole region as a laboratory where you can build sustainable peace. And in Nariño, there are three armed groups, at least at the moment. You have the ELN with the Frente Comuneros del Sur, you have the Segunda Marquetalia, and you have the Estado Mayor Central. Two of these groups former dissidents of the FARC. And so when we are thinking about the territorial approach in Nariño, we need to take into account those other groups. And we need to take into account something else, and is the governor of Nariño. So this idea of territorial peace in Nariño is being the political flag of the governor of Nariño, who is part of the Pacto Histórico, who is the same political party of the president of Colombia. So there is a really important political dimension that connects the idea of a peace policy from Bogota with the peace policy of Pasto in Nariño. And those two things are connected. And what they have seen is that the Frente Comuneros del Sur is ready to start a negotiation process with very concrete steps to think about disarming and reincorporating in Nariño, doing restorative gestures with the communities, and actually moving and helping the local government to do structural reforms to overcome poverty and marginalization. Could the ELN at the national level sabotage this? Yes, indeed. I mean, that's one of the main concerns, because the Dirección Nacional of the ELN and the COSE are not very happy that this Frente Comuneros del Sur has decided to splinter from the ELN and take their own path connected to the regional dynamics. What does the Colombian government has to offer to the Frente Comuneros del Sur and to Nariño in general? Has to offer security conditions, security guarantees that these other groups are not gonna come into the territory and start killing former combatants, as has happened with some of the members of the FARC who reincorporate into society. So this means a comprehensive approach in which human security from the side of the Ministry of Defense is brought into the region, connected to the UN, I guess, an international monitoring mechanism to make sure that these groups do not enter the territory, and make sure that the Frente Comuneros del Sur and Segunda Marquetalia, who has also expressed interest on negotiating with the Colombian government in Nariño and start a peace lab there, can do a multilateral agreement that connects Frente Comuneros del Sur, Segunda Marquetalia, and the local government. I think that's the way how we should start thinking about Nariño, because it's challenging this idea of parallel negotiations with different groups that is happening at the national level, and is sort of saying multi-level, multi-actor negotiations with structural transformations on the ground in this particular moment.
It's multilateral territorial negotiations. I can see that. It's it's a mouthful and the complexities leap out at us. I think we need to move on to, because you've mentioned the Segunda Marquetalia and you mentioned the EMC, which is the Estado Mayor Central. These are two dissident groups, those who didn't sign up, members of the FARC who didn't sign up to the peace accords in 2016, and some of those who returned to arms post-peace accord. And they're making moves in these areas too. But if I'm not mistaken, the Estado Mayor Central, the EMC, has been on again, off again negotiations since September last year. And the Segunda Marquetalia has just announced, I guess about a week ago, that they are sitting down with the government. So this is positive, but we don't hear this positive news. But are these, I mean, these are people who had the opportunity to sign up under the very complete peace accords, the points as written down and decided in Cuba, in Havana, Cuba in 2016. Why should they then receive, let's say, better circumstances this time around after having turned it down in 2016?
Well, we don't know if they are going to get better circumstances. Let's start from there. This is already, I would say, that's what a person from the Centro Democrático probably would be saying. We don't know. We really don't know. Now, let me take into pieces, because probably for your listeners, it's important to understand the huge difference between these two groups. The Estado Mayor Central, or EMC, did not sign the 2016 peace agreement. Most of their leaders became a splintering group, just like the Frente Comuneros del Sur is doing now in Nariño. They became a splintering group of the FARC before the final agreement was signed. And the reason for that was because they didn't agree with the idea of handing over the weapons before the structural reforms that the state had promised were done. So they thought that it was too sooner to give up the weapons as soon as they sign up the peace agreement. So what they said is, we don't trust the state, we're going to keep our weapons. Now, this was a small group of the FARC. The Frente Primero, that was the splintering group, had only 400 members. The Colombian state thought at the time, we can actually dismantle them in no time. We can, destroy them very quickly. And one part of the peace agreement was that the government committed to dismantle any illegal armed groups that stayed in the territory that represented a threat to the former combatants of the FARC. Now, during the Duque presidency, they went from 400 to 3,500 fighters. They spread across the whole country, and they became a serious security threat that could not be defeated militarily at that point. So when you cannot defeat a group militarily, what do? You try to open negotiations, but because the humanitarian suffering is too high. So what the first peace commissioner of Petro did was to explore if there was a political will of these groups to start a negotiation process with the Colombian government. And that process started. He saw the political will, and what it happened in this negotiation was that they were trying to bring together different factions that had been fighting and against the Colombian state, but they didn't have the time to become very solid in terms of their union, because it takes years for a group that is spread over the whole territory to create a line of command that is very clear and centralized. So the negotiations started. And as the negotiations started, some of the fronts were not 100% committed with some of the bilateral ceasefire measures that were asked for by the government. And that created a tension within the fronts. And the government, in the middle of the negotiations, saw that there was a split of the EMC between two factions. One that said, we are not willing to de-escalate. We want to see more of the structural reforms of the state. And the other one that said, we want to stay at the negotiation table and we are willing to de-escalate the armed conflict. So now, in this particular moment, the Colombian state is fighting a full-fledged war against one of the factions of the EMC in southern Colombia, in Cauca, Valle del Cauca, Nariño, and is at the negotiation table with the other faction of the group that is mainly in Catatumbo and the Middle Magdalena Valley. So that is 40% of the EMC are still at the negotiation tables. And I think in this particular moment that we are talking, they're starting the sixth cycle of negotiations with this faction of the EMC. Now, that's it. Sorry, I'm just going to move to the Segunda Marquetalia quite quickly. The Segunda Marquetalia is led by Ivan Marquez. This is really important to understand. Some of your listeners might remember this name because Ivan Marquez was the chief negotiator of the FARC in the Havana negotiations, and he signed the peace agreement in 2016. But he left the reincorporation process. He laid down his weapon, and he was going to become a senator of Colombia. But he left the peace process because now, according to research done by the UN, there was a strategy carried out by the CIA and the Colombian prosecutor office to try to get them, to entrap them and get them and extradite them to the US, to extradite Ivan Marquez to the US. So he felt that he didn't have judicial security and went up and take up arms. And he's been fighting since 2019, and he called his group Segunda Marquetalia. He has also tried to build up alliances with different groups across the country. He's mainly based in Venezuela, but he has built up alliances with two groups, one in Nariño and one in Putumayo. And he's the leader of that coalition of groups. The Segunda Marquetalia started negotiations with the first peace commissioner of Gustavo Petro 2 years ago, but it took 2 years to build trust between the Segunda Marquetalia and the Colombian state. And what we saw last week is that finally, the first round of negotiations, formal negotiations between the Segunda Marquetalia and the Colombian government have taken place. And it seems that is in the second phase of total peace under the second peace commissioner of Gustavo Petro, there is much more attention paid to the design phase of the negotiations. And for that reason, we are seeing a very clear timetable of clear measures that are going to be monitored for this peace process to move faster. So my expectation with the Segunda Marquetalia is that we are going to have a faster negotiation than the one that we have had with the Estado Mayor Central and the ELN, because the political conditions are better and because it took a longer period of time of building trust between the parties and working on the design of the negotiations behind closed doors. And this is because, of course, Ivan Marquez is perhaps one of the Colombians who has more expertise on negotiating with the Colombian state. So he knows what it takes, and probably he's got a really important invested interest in these negotiations working with Gustavo Petro.
Question that: how big is the Segunda Marquetalia?
We know that today they have around 1,700 fighters in arms spread in these 3 regions of the country.
And I mean, you mentioned, of course, that Ivan Marquez is there with his team in Venezuela. We're all watching for the elections on the 28th of July in neighboring Venezuela, and how this, I mean, inevitably, somehow Colombia's peace, Paz Total, will be affected. I think we can say that the regime of Nicolas Maduro has tacitly approved or permitted most of these armed groups within its territory return in some way or another. And if Edmundo Gonzalez gets in as well, if he's allowed to get in, I mean, that's a whole different conversation that I'll be having with a Venezuelan expert before long. But they will be expected to try and erase these groups as well within their territory, force them out. There are so many threads to be pulled here that it is a concern. But rather than talk about that quickly, but I know that we have other groups in Colombia as well. Of course we do. And the biggest, most effective, most, I would say, damaging group presently, and I'm very reluctant to say that they are, they are distant relatives to what was the autodefensas unidas in Colombia, the AUC, and then the Águilas Negras, and then the Urabeños, and now we call them the Clan de Golfo or the Gaitanistas. This is a mafia group that runs through the country and controls, people trafficking, drugs, arms, anything, extortion. How does the government negotiate in Paz Total, alongside these other groups? How do you negotiate with this illegal entity that is financially violent?
That's a great question, and but just one thing in terms of Venezuela, because I think you made a really important point there. We think that getting the negotiations done with Segunda Marquetalia is a win-win solution for anyone who is in power in Venezuela. You don't want these groups to continue strengthen themselves because they don't obey to Maduro. That's a simplistic reading. When you have illegal armed groups, they create their own dynamics and they become a very serious threat to the governability of a country. So I think that getting these negotiations done is a win-win for everyone who is involved in this. And that's the reason why Venezuela has played such an important role. If we think about the negotiations with Segunda Marquetalia, Venezuela, Cuba, Norway are the three countries that are the guarantors of the negotiations. Venezuela has been absolutely fundamental. So we don't expect a radical shift if a new government comes in Venezuela. What we expect is that probably there will be more pressures to get the negotiations done quickly. And I think the parties have started to pay attention to this. For that reason, the second cycle of negotiations with the Segunda Marquetalia is going to be in Cuba the second week of August. So you always have an option to move the negotiation table from one country to the other to make sure that the political conditions in those countries do not affect the cycles of negotiation. And the same is happening with the ELN. As we know, the negotiations do not take place all the time in the same city, but usually move between Havana and Caracas. And in some cases, the negotiations with the ELN have been taking place in Bogota. And with the Estado Mayor Central, the same. Actually, with the Estado Mayor Central, most of the cycles of negotiations are taking place within Colombia. In Colombia, in Bogota, or in some of the regions heavily affected by the armed conflict. And this is a really radical departure from the strategy of negotiations of President Juan Manuel Santos, for example, where he was constantly negotiating outside Colombia, and people in the regions felt really disconnected from the peace process. They felt that only the guys with the arms were in the negotiations far away from the regions where the conflict was happening, whereas with total peace, what the people in the regions feel is that the negotiations are happening right there in the doorstep. This happened with the EMC in Kivu, in Guaviare. The same has happened with the ELN in Bogota when they launched the participation process with civil society. So I think this is something that is really important for your listeners to understand of a radical departure from the negotiations with Santos. What has happened with the Clan del Golfo is the government has tried to engage in negotiations with them. Following the example of whom? Well, following the example of Álvaro Uribe, former president of Colombia. We have had negotiations with paramilitary groups already. We had negotiations with them in 2003 till 2006. And a particular legal framework was created for that. Petro has tried to engage with them, with these inheritors of paramilitary groups, with Gaitanistas, with this weird group that has been evolving ever since 2008. Now, the main obstacle, there are many obstacles, but one of the greatest obstacles was the last prosecutor general, not the new, but there was a prosecutor general who put all the sticks on the wheel in order to try to lift the orders to capture them, to capture the voceros of the Clan del Golfo, to sit in negotiations with the Colombian government. That was the first problem. And now the second problem is that there was a law to try to bring these criminal groups into Colombian society, or ley de sometimiento. And the Colombian Congress did not approve it during the first year of the presidency of Gustavo Petro. So the Clan del Golfo, or these inheritor of paramilitary groups, feel that they don't have a legal framework that makes these negotiations serious, a possibility. And so now, with the arrival of the new peace commissioner of Gustavo Petro, we know that there is still some discussions going on behind the closed doors, but this is mainly about thinking how these people are gonna, what are they gonna do with their money? What are we gonna do with their structures, with their connections with the political, economic, legal elites in the regions? And what are we going to do in order to avoid the recycling of violence from one generation to the other, because the youth in those regions do not have any other opportunities than joining these groups? So this is not about thinking huge structural reforms in Colombia with these groups, but it's more thinking about what are the practical steps that need to be taken in order to dismantle the groups and to deal with the illegal money that was made through this. And there is willingness of some of these groups, at least we have heard some of the leaders of the Clan del Golfo saying that they are willing to sit down with the Colombian government to think about a way out of the war in Colombia. But these are the challenges that we're facing at the moment.
And then finally, as we sort of address what we've taken the multilateral territorial peace within Colombia, there is an urban peace approach as well. And this is also part of that territorial practice, because cities such as Medellin, very well known for its problems in the 90s, 80s, they still exist to this day, but are very well publicized improvements take the headlines. But then you've got a city like Buenaventura on the Pacific coast, which is known for all the wrong reasons. That is a terribly violent place. So the government has an urban peace approach as well.
Yes, I think that's again, perhaps, we're writing this report that we will publish in early August, a report jointly written between Rodeemos, El Dialogo, Justice for Colombia, and the University of Winchester. And one of the key findings of this report is that one of the incredible innovations of the total peace policy is that for the first time connects urban peace with rural peace. And if you think about the negotiations between Santos and the FARC, it was all about the marginalized territories of the country. It was about creating the special territorial spaces for development in 170 municipalities far away in the margins of Colombia. But there was no discussion about the role of the cities. There was no discussion about what do we do with many of the people who have been affected by the violence in the margins and who have moved up to cities like Bogota or Medellin or Buenaventura. And what do we do with those former combatants that never disarm or demobilize, but actually decide to move into the cities, and by moving into the cities, create gangs, and how those gangs, in a way, are connected with some of these big illegal armed groups? Because there is, if you cannot dismantle the Gaitanistas without understanding the connections of them with some of the gangs and combos in Medellin. It is an absolutely important thing. You cannot solve the problem of ELN and EMC and Clan del Golfo in Valle del Cauca without understanding how they interact with Buenaventura. So the key innovation of this total peace policy is we have to start an urban peace approach, and we need to synchronize that with the urban level. And so they prioritize, the Petro government prioritized 3 cities to start like pilot projects. The first was Buenaventura, where they started with a ceasefire or a tregua, a truce between 2 of the combos, Chotas and Espartanos, and that reduced the levels of homicide in 60%. There was a moment in Buenaventura where the homicides in a whole month, more than 2 months, as far as I remember, was 0. So they showed that they have an incredible control over the violence of the cities. Okay, and in Medellin, they have managed to start a space of what is called socio-juridical dialogue, because these are non-negotiations in terms of thinking about the groups as if they were insurgencies, but this is about thinking about the combos and the gangs that are in the cities as actors that need to be sort of brought back into society by finding ways of dismantling the structures. But in the case of Medellin, you have 17 gangs, voceros of gangs, spokespersons of gangs, sitting in a negotiation or in a space of dialogue with the Colombian government, thinking about how they can not only reduce the levels of violence in the city, where homicide was reduced in 60%, but actually thinking about how the structures that have been created through organized crime can be transformed into peace infrastructures that allow the city to have this other, illegal structure that keeps the levels of violence low. And then the other city is Quibdó, where the gangs are very different. They are very small gangs. They are mainly like neighborhood gangs. They are starting to get connected with Mexican drug cartels. They are starting to get connected with the ELN, but they are still very small groups where the young have joined because they don't have education. They don't have the minimum access to food. They are starving there. So the gangs are a way of creating an identity, solidarity, and so the idea was let's focus on Quibdó and let's try to solve that problem, before it becomes too big. Now the main problem that we have, and with this I would close, is that it is a lot of work for one office. The office of the High Commissioner for Peace, at the same time dealing with this and at the same time dealing with the other peace processes, is a lot. And it's a challenge because also most of the times when you think about how we deal with gangs in Central America or in places like Medellin, it's been done through the local governments. And when you have local governments who are not really connected to the peace policy of the government, like in the case of Medellin, you really have an institutional blockage there. How do you overcome something like that? It's a tremendous challenge. And at this moment, some of these negotiation tables with the gangs are stuck, are a bit frozen. And that's the main challenge that we have.
Legal issues prevent, of course, needs to be an agreement between those two sides within the government, the government, the local government. I see that as being almost more conflicting than the gangs themselves dealing with the national government. But no, that said, so I mean, the feeling I get as we wind this down, the feeling I get is you genuinely believe that there is a light at the end of the tunnel for a lot of these negotiations. Being, for the most part, the Segundo Marquetalia. They are, again, as you say, prepared to negotiate. They come to the table with knowledge of negotiation. And it's not the biggest group, but it would be a huge success story to be able to then say, listen, the Segunda Marquetalia is no longer a belligerent force within Colombia. But I mean, do you feel that the next 2 years of Petro's presidency, he can pull off some big wins?
In the report that we are writing that I just mentioned, we are making some recommendations. We think that he can really, produce incredible results in the next 2 years. He won't solve the armed conflict in Colombia. We don't think that you could get to a point in which you sign final peace agreements with the ELN, with the EMC, with the Segunda Marquetalia, with the Clan del Golfo, and you get all these cities sorted. But what you can do is unleash a process that is irreversible. And we believe that there is a really important transformation already taking place. It's already taking place, but there is a need to make some important efforts to make sure that this total peace policy delivers. And I would say that two of the main obstacles that we haven't identified, and you mentioned this at the beginning, Richard, is public opinion. because what we see is that probably all these things that I've been sharing with you are mostly unknown to Colombians, and the political opposition has won the narrative war. So they have imposed a discourse that shows that under total peace, security is worse in Colombia than before, and is a total is something that has not ground in reality. We've seen some indicators, traditional indicators of security and violence that show that levels of homicide in some of the places have been reduced, and that overall the trend of direct violence is going down. Okay, but one thing is what the indicators tell you, and another thing is the perception of society. And the perception in society is created by media, by mainstream media, and public opinion is fundamental, because if you don't get the cities to understand the progress that you have done, you are going to get people in the cities voting in order to punish Petro, because they think that the country is worse off than before. And if you don't have 4 more years of a government that is committed to continue with a total peace approach, that is willing to continue with the negotiation tables that already started, and with some of the structural process of transformation in some territories that have started, what you're going to get is a full-fledged conflict around the corner after 2026. So that's the second point that we are trying to say, and we think is one of the biggest challenges for the Colombian government, is you need to find a way of shaping this national agreement around the importance of total peace. And that requires humility from the side of the president, and the willingness to weave together a coalition with sectors of the left, the center, and the right, as Petro did to be elected himself in 2022. But the question is it possible to do something now that he knows that he's on the way out? And who is willing from the center and from the right to join forces to protect the idea of finally closing the armed conflict in Colombia? And one point that can bring people together, in particular the Santistas, and let me just say this because it's something that we have totally overlooked in this conversation, is one point that can bring people together is the implementation of the 2016 peace agreement. And that's the other pillar of total peace, because total peace does recognize that one of the main reasons why we have the reproduction of the conflict in Colombia and the recycling of groups is because of the lack of political will of the Duque administration to implement the peace agreement, and left a humongous problem that now, of course, for Petro has been very difficult to undo. But the political will to implement the peace agreement is there despite all the obstacles. And I think that can bring Santismo together, Petrismo together, and other sectors to try to see if between 2026 and 2030, that is the last 4 years of the 15 years of the implementation of the peace agreement, become an opportunity to close the armed conflict in Colombia for good.
There's a lot to think about in this conversation. Perhaps you could just tell us the name of the report that's coming out in August.
It's going to be called 2 Years of Total Peace, Challenges, Opportunities, and Recommendations.
Okay, well, please be sure to send it our way, because it sounds like for some people like myself, absolutely obligatory reading. This is how I like to spend my free time, discussing peace in Colombia. But actually, it's been really, really informative chatting to you, Andrei, and hopefully we can share more of the information about what is going on behind the scenes in Colombia and away from the headlines. And that's part of the idea of this podcast, that we'll a deep dive into subjects, topics taking place in the region of Latin America. So let me take this moment to say thank you so much to Andrei Gómez Súarez, who is a senior researcher at the University of Winchester and general director of the Anglo Colombian peacebuilding organizing association called Rodeemos, Dialogo. And they have a joint report coming out in August with Rodeemos and Dialogo, Justice for Colombia, and Winchester University. So watch this space. Thank you again, everyone, for listening to the LatinNews Podcast. I'm Richard McCoy, your host here in Bogota, Colombia. Please subscribe, share, and talk about the LatinNews Podcast, because we're moving out there and growing week on week. But the idea is to be a firm voice from the region in English for all of you. Thank you again, and bye-bye.